Welcome to Kinship Cafe. So glad you could join us today. We are going to be continuing our discussion of the Tao Te Ching, and we're on chapter 16, I believe. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. All right. Everybody seen that okay?
Yep.
Perfect. So, in order to kind of get at the core of what this chapter is about, we're going to have to review a couple of core concepts. So we'll start with the opening line of the Tao Te Ching. So it's very terse in terms of what it says, and it sounds a little bit cryptic. So we'll kind of break it down again. But Tao is not being translated here. If we were going to translate Tao, it would be something like way, as in the way you do something, or the way of things, or a way of life. So it could also read then, way can weigh, not constant way. And we can see there's some pieces of this that don't exactly make sense. And this is because these characters in Chinese can be both nouns and verbs depending on context. So really what we'd want to say is something like the way that can be weighed, or the way that can be followed, is not the constant way. So the point that's being brought up here is that there's different ways that are available or possible, but there's something that is a constant way that they're concerned about, not the other kinds of ways, in this case, the ways that can be followed. So if we were to break this down a bit and say, there's a way to get to the grocery store, and I tell you the names of the streets and the way you got to turn, and then ultimately you can get there. You can follow my way and get there, but you also have the possibility of not following it and not getting there. And so what they're essentially trying to get at here is that there is a way that exists in the universe that you can't not follow, that you basically have to follow whether you want to or not. And this would be things that we talk about in terms of laws of nature or laws of physics. So we might talk about something like gravity. Gravity is one of the ways of the world that it doesn't matter if you're ignorant of it, or if you don't agree with it, or if you want to fight against it. Don't matter. You're still going to have to follow it no matter what. And this is the type of ways then that they're concerned about in this discussion. They're not concerned about the ways that somebody's proposing. And so if we think about the context of when the Tao Te Ching arises, which is this Warring States period, and we have a proliferation of different ways that are being promoted, basically, what are the different ways we might find ourselves out of this mess of this, Warring States period. So Confucianism, Taoism, many others, they call it the 100 schools of thought, are all proposing different ways. And so the Taoist response to that is, any of these ways that somebody's proposing, like Confucius, they are proposing a way, but it's a way that you can choose to follow or not follow. And therefore, it doesn't really count as much as this constant way that you don't have a choice to follow. These other ones where you have the option, they're humanly constructed, they're derived. And because of that, they're potentially full of problems. And that's what they're trying to avoid here. So the issue is this idea of constant. And this gets translated lots of different ways. Sometimes it's eternal and so forth. But I think constant makes better sense here, because part of what they're getting at is not that it's static, not that it's not changing, but that it is perpetual, in the sense of, we can think about like seasons. Seasons go through changes, but the cycle of seasons stays the same. And that's kind of more the idea that they're trying to get at. There's not really so much this idea of permanence within Taoism, except when we think about something like this constant Tao, this pattern that seems to be consistent regardless. So that's why it stands out. This is the thing that they're noticing, that they're wanting to understand more about. And because they are ways that the world works, the idea is the more we can bring our actions into alignment with that, the better off we're going to be, because we're not going to be fighting against, in this sense, nature. We're going to be working with it. A little bit of a review there. Everything tracking okay with that?
Yeah.
Okay. So then another quick kind of review of the overall kind of worldview. So we talked about Tao, the way of things. It's kind of like this outer layer here, but again, they're not really different layers. We want to think about this as all kind of a piece. We're just talking about different aspects of it. So one aspect of this worldview is that there's patterns that are discernible, and this would be the Tao, the way of things. And then within this context, there's in a sense, we could say there is no nothing. Everything is something, even the things that seem like emptiness or absence, or where it seems like there's vacuum, they would stay, there's still something. And we could kind of equate this to more of a modern way of thinking about this, where we would say that everything is, made up of stuff. Like even the space between us is made up of atoms that make up these gases of, oxygen and other things in our atmosphere. But even at a quantum level, they would argue, at least with some quantum interpretations, such as loop quantum gravity or relational quantum the interpretation that's based on the relational view would say that space itself is quantized, and so there's never a nothing. Everything is a something, but it's going in and out of different configurations that become more present to us. So there's this idea of absence, which we could say is whatever the substance is without form. And then there's presence, which is that same substance, but with form. In the same way that we might talk about, atoms combining into molecules, into larger and larger structures until it becomes something that's visible to us, that we would see as a thing. And the Chinese way of talking about that is the 10,000 things. But there's that movement constantly from absence to presence and then back again, returning to the source. Or sometimes it's talking about this movement back and forth is the heaven's gate, or various different ways that they kind of talk about this movement. And then within the 10,000 things, there's a relationship between those things that is this constant balance between yin and yang. And again, the goal is how do we come in harmony, both from this concept of yin and yang, but also with the Tao in terms of these ultimate patterns. It would be, in a nutshell, kind of the big picture worldview that we see within Taoism. We've kind of covered this a number of times, but I just want to pause to see if there's any additional questions or thoughts about this. Okay. I'm sorry, what's that?
I was just gonna say it's good to have those recaps once in a while.
Oh, good. So we've got two key concepts here that we want to just kind of keep in mind. One is this idea of constant being important as far as the Tao is concerned, and also this idea that ultimately everything is one thing, just in different configurations. These are two key elements that we want to keep in mind. So then with this particular chapter that we're looking at, chapter 16, it's going to be addressing the urgency to perceive both the constant and the one. And so we'll kind of see how that unfolds. And with that, we'll jump into the text. Attain the utmost emptiness, secure, unbroken stillness. So maybe we'll pause there for a second. So when we're talking about emptiness, we're in relationship to the mind at this point. So there's various traditions that will talk about how they'll want to use like mindfulness or meditation in different ways to try and bring a stillness to the mind, and try to get, in a sense, the thoughts to settle, almost like in the last chapter we talked about the mud puddle with the mud getting stirred up and it was murky, but if you're still long enough, the mud settles. So the stillness helps with how you bring about that clarity, and that emptiness. But within the Taoist tradition, based off of kind of what we've talked about, what do you think they're trying to empty from their mind when they're trying to attain this?
The new ideas that would throw this authority balance off.
I didn't quite catch all that. You said new ideas. What?
That would throw out the balance of power. You know,
Oh,
suppress the rebellion, potential for rebellion. Because we talked about it in a couple sessions ago as well, how they talked about the authority of the higher classes and such. So there was I remember there being a feeling of the Taoism being listen to your elders and don't question them kind of situation.
You mean challenging that idea of
Yeah,
the
yeah,
social hierarchy?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So something like social hierarchies, then we could kind of group within a larger context we might call social constructions of reality, right?
Mhm.
So frequently what they're trying to get at with that stillness or bringing that clarity is to have more of an unobscured view of reality as it is, as opposed to things that are filtering our view, that are bringing in different humanly derived values, humanly derived, hierarchies and statuses that aren't actually there, but only exist as a construct that can serve to hinder our ability to see clearly what reality is. So they're not necessarily saying we want to empty our head of everything, right? It's more specifically that we want to be able to see clearly and recognize those things that are attempting to give filters to our vision. Doesn't mean that ultimately we don't find any of those useful, and there may be things that we hold on to, but first we need to be able to have more of a clear perspective of what is, and then we can evaluate these different filters a little bit more in terms of how do we want to apply these, or do we want to apply these, or are these helpful? Do they lead towards that harmony? Are they leading towards being in alignment with the way of things, or are they in contrast to that? Is the reason that we're struggling because we're trying to implement a view that is inconsistent with reality? Those would be the kinds of questions that they ask. So when we get to this point then of this emptiness, this clarity of thought and vision, he continues to say, the myriad things, this would be another way that the 10,000 things is translated. The myriad things arise together and we watch their return. So this is that movement from absence to presence and back again. We see them arise and they kind of grow and flourish. And then we also watch them return back to what seems like nothingness. Though they flourish in great numbers, each returns again to the source. Returning to the source is called stillness. And this is interesting because we could say stillness in the sense of it's not alive anymore. It's, we sometimes equate death with things like sleeping. So we could see where stillness kind of comes into play here. But then he kind of expands on this a little bit further and says, stillness is called returning life. Isn't that an interesting phrase? What are your takes on that?
I could see it as this returning to like the great source, because eventually it'll flow back out and like becomes one of the other 10,000 things, like kind of go and form something else.
Yeah, I think I have kind of a similar thought there. Anything else come to mind?
it's I still get the feeling of, even what you talked about just a minute ago, it feels like it's suppressing the creativity. It's not suppressing per se, but it's discouraging from creativity. Don't think about things, just look at the reality. Don't think in the head, don't have your heads in the clouds, don't imagine things. And this being the return to life, just do the basics, do the bare reality almost.
Interesting. Yeah, I can see where you would come with to that kind of a conclusion. My suspicion is that at this point, it's not so much as a lot of traditions within Taoism definitely involve creativity, let's say, like music is a key thing, movement in the sense of, like, ultimately Tai Chi is a martial art that's born out of Taoist thinking and so forth. So I don't know that they would be saying that we don't want to be creative in how we think about things or how we address things. They do bring up, that the vessel has value because of its emptiness. The wheel has value because of its emptiness, the house. So they're using technology, right, in terms of wheels and pots and houses. They're not in the sense of anti learning or technology. But here, I think what they're trying to get at is during that moment when we're really focusing on taking any of these humanly derived ways of thinking about things and setting them aside for a moment so that we can see clearly, one of the things that we notice very clearly is that things go through these cycles. They flourish, they grow, and then they die and they return. And this idea of returning life, it's, I mean, to me, it almost kind of sounds like, what they say in The Lion King, where they talk about, the circle of life, right? That there's this big cycle. And I think this is really central to a lot of the different indigenous voices, which we would say with, this philosophical Taoism frequently, that is trying to reassert kind of this Paleolithic voice about how it was looking at the world as opposed to what was going on at the time. So I think I wouldn't take it as we're taking off all these filters so we can see clearly what is, and what is just a cycle that happens, and so don't do anything. I don't think that's ultimately where they're going with this idea. I think this is kind of like the starting point. Like, we need to have kind of a foundation of understanding where we are and what kind of things we are before we can answer the question of what should we be doing. That's kind of how I think that this would be laid out. So continuing then, it says, returning life is the meaning of constancy. So here we've got this term again, constance, coming back into play, and recognizing again this cycle that continues is part of that constancy, part of that Tao, that way that continues, that is unavoidable. There's no way to get out of it. There's no way to not follow it. It's just the way everything goes. And we are part of that everything, right? We are born at a certain point and we go through life, we get older and we die, and the cycle starts over again with another new life. So we are part of that in the same sense that everything else is. To know constancy, to understand these cycles, to understand these patterns, is enlightenment. Not to know constancy risks disasters. What do you think he's getting at with that line?
I keep going back to the perception that I keep getting from this is the more we just do what the reality is in front of us, the more we maintain the status quo without the teachings, the things that we want to be doing, or the social hierarchy from the top down wants us to be doing. If we just do it without, the drive that the higher levels want, it risks free thinking risks rebellions and such. I don't know why, but this just keeps coming as the not necessarily propaganda, I want to say, but the teaching of just do the things the way we want you to do the way we are teaching you to do that, do the things, live your life the way we're telling you to, without a lot of thinking. Just do as you're told, because if you don't do the things the way we're expecting you to do, and you start thinking outside of the box, we are jeopardizing the system.
I
So
think for me, it's less about like what Martin is talking about, like the system of like humans and like what we've created, like in that sense, and more about the system, so to say, of just like the universe. And it brings me back to that parable of the man and the horse running away, and like the sun, and like resisting like the change and the stuff, what happens, like, and resisting, maybe like really pushing against it and like getting all caught up, like that risks disasters. But to know that like everything is going to be changing, and to kind of like take it and just like be aware and not get like too emotional about everything, that is like the enlightenment piece.
hmm. So there's more kind of focusing on this acceptance of change is maybe how you're seeing this.
Yeah.
Okay. And then Martin, I wanted to get some clarity. So you were saying that this idea of thinking outside of the box risks wrecking the system. Who like are you suggesting that that's what the Taoist thinking is promoting, or what it's fighting against? I wasn't clear on how you were looking at that.
This chapter is evoking in me that the Taoism is promoting the not think outside of the box, and stick with what we are telling you, what the teaching that the Taoism is providing. This is the teaching. This is the way you should do. And if you're gonna if you're gonna not think, so if you're not going to follow this teaching, you're gonna do things outside of the Taoism box, you're gonna wreck the systems we're putting in place with it.
Interesting. I would like to push back on that a little bit.
Absolutely.
Um, so, and I'm going to just back up a little bit as to do this. So we could argue that this opening line is a should. We could argue that. It might not be, but it could be argued that. But my thought is more along the lines that if you attain this utmost emptiness and secure that unbroken stillness for the effect of being able to see clearly, it's very much not trying to suggest, here's the patterns, here's the rules that we want you to follow. It's saying, strip that stuff away so you can see more clearly what actually is. It's not about trying to bring other elements in place. It's saying, open your mind, get rid of all the constraints that society is putting on you, and just look at what is actually there. The next part of it is not saying this is what you need to understand, as much as, if you do that, what do you observe? And part of what he's observing is stuff comes and stuff goes. Nothing stays the same. It's constantly evolving. There's no thing that doesn't have kind of a beginning and also an end, and somehow it kind of circles back around. And the only thing that seems to be constant are these patterns. Everything else changes. I wouldn't suggest that they're trying to argue these points in terms of this is what you need to believe, but they're encouraging you to look with clear eyes at the world around you and see if you don't see this same pattern.
I see this, and I cannot disagree with that. I guess my maybe just my skepticism is coming from teachings that I have learned about oftentimes are used for manipulation and gaining power, right? I was just not too long ago, I watched the Shiny Happy People, and it's just like telling the wives, don't think about it. Let others let others do the thinking for you. And this whole don't don't do anything, just observe. Let's see the most, even if you're talking about the most basic reality, even if you observe it changing, it just feels like it's it's encouraging inaction almost. Just, you know
Hmm.
what, it's reality, don't do anything. It's just, it will, if you don't like it, it will pass. If you do like it, it will pass anyway. And this inactivity or lack of engagement, to me, kind of feels like you're breeding tools and people who are not rebelling to the ideas. And maybe it's just a matter of that this is just creating a breeding ground for people to take advantage of others. Not necessarily that the system itself is to take advantage, it's just maybe creating places where people are just, you know what, it's someone's doing something bad, it all shall pass.
So think about this. We have these competing ways that are all in the marketplace of ideas. Excuse me. So Warren States period, everything's kind of going bonkers, and you've got everybody kind of coming up with their prescription for the solution, including, let's say, Confucius, because Confucius is one of the ones that really persisted, as well as Taoism. Right from the beginning, the Taoist critique is extremely severe in terms of the core of what the Confucianists are proposing. So it's not a quietist movement in the sense that it doesn't challenge the status quo. It's a serious challenge to, well, let's say maybe it's not even the status quo at that point, because it's one of the other ways that's on offer, but it's definitely doing a very strong critique about other proposed ways. So it's not, in the sense, not engaging with, wrestling with, or arguing for, trying to do or be something. I think that what we're seeing here, especially in the opening lines, is more kind of a starting point for how they're going to suggest we need to approach these things. And the starting point is get rid of these other worldviews that are confusing your perception. See what is, don't just take for granted what they're telling you. It's almost the exact opposite, right? It's like, get rid of all the stuff that people have told you is the way it is, and just look for yourself. It's kind of like, an ultimate liberation, where we don't often recognize that we're, swimming in the water, to notice, oh, I actually am in water. I need to notice that, right? That's like step number one. And in doing so, they want to notice the patterns. Like, what happens when you take off all the filters? What do you see? One of the core things we see is this consistent pattern of things coming and going. Now, that's not making any determination at this point about what you should or shouldn't do, but it is making the point here that saying that to know this, to recognize this constancy of these patterns, is the beginning of like this enlightenment, of being able to actually see what's there. But if you don't know this constancy, it risks disaster. So if the constancy is seen clearly, reality and the patterns of how reality works, if somebody's ignorant of those things, what kinds of disasters might ensue? Why would not knowing that risk disaster?
See, I hear that, and maybe I'm just seeing it too much of a change too much of a tool. Maybe this is a little bit more deeper than I have perceived in the past. So I hear you. I'll take that in.
Well, this isn't meant to try and convert anybody to a particular way of thinking, but just to try and understand more of the position that they're coming from and what are they trying to express. Whether or not we agree with them or believe
Yeah.
it is a whole other story.
I think this is fair because I obviously this is a big deep thinking that I don't do or very often. So I think I appreciate the guidance in terms of, hey, I hear you, but maybe you're thinking about it in too much or restrained way, and this is a bit bigger than what you were thinking. I appreciate that feedback. So
Well, it's not
I'm not
an,
trying, yeah.
yeah, it's not an uncommon critique that I come across sometimes about Taoism, is that it's more of this quietist kind of thing that allows other people to maybe take advantage of, or that they're not going to be concerned about different issues because everything's just, going through these cycles. And I think that the very fact that this actually exists is saying something contrary to that very mode of thinking. They are taking, in a sense, a stance, right? And they're arguing for something. And what they're arguing for is, almost kind of like that Bob Marley song, about no one but us can free our minds, emancipate yourselves from mental slavery. and that's more kind of the direction I see that this is trying to promote, is to free that thinking, not to constrain the thinking, but to free it. And in that freeing, recognize what things are constant, what are the patterns in this ever-changing environment. And that's crucial, they would say here, for kind of this contrast between enlightenment and disasters. So if I was thinking through this, in some of our modern contexts, there's a lot of discussion about, what's going on with the climate, or we could think about, how we utilize resources and all that kind of stuff. Is that the more we're ignorant of these patterns of understanding the way things are, the way things work in the world, we run the risk of, creating a mess of it, because we're not recognizing those patterns. We're not recognizing how things operate. We aren't taking into consideration how everything is interconnected. And so we think we can treat everything as an individuated object that can just be used without repercussion. And what we're finding out is that whole way of thinking was completely flawed. And we've got all kinds of problems now, whether we're talking about extinctions of different species. And this isn't new with the modern age, right? I mean, even with going back into that Paleolithic period, humans caused all kinds of climate changes, changes to the environment in terms of wiping out large, life forms. There was a lot of that happened because we didn't know, right? And so that's what they're trying to get at, is if you're ignorant of the way the world actually works, you're setting yourself up for a disaster. It's important to understand it. And that would be kind of the key point that I think is being brought up at this point, is that if you don't know that, and we might also bring into mind that there's good reason to believe that the Tao Te Ching is addressing not just individuals, but specifically potential rulers, right? There's a lot of discussion about how do you run the empire? How do you govern? And so the question here is, if you don't understand these basic things, you might really head things for disaster, especially if you're thinking about it from more of a governing perspective. So then he says, to know constancy is to be tolerant. And I think that we could look at this kind of like what Katja was saying in terms of this acceptance of understanding that everything is in flow. But again, understanding that everything is in flow isn't necessarily to say that there isn't anything that we do, or we just accept everything as it is. I think it gets more into the idea of the value judgments. So with the parable that she was bringing up about the farmer whose horse runs away, and you had the initial villager's reaction, oh, how unfortunate. And he says, well, we'll see. And then the horse comes back with a bunch more horses and they say, oh, how fortunate. And the old man says, we'll see. They're wanting to put these value judgments on these things that are happening. And he's saying it keeps flip-flopping, right? So first you said it was a bad thing the horse ran away. Now you're saying it's a good thing that he came back with all these other ones. Then his son's riding on the horses, trying to break him in, breaks his leg. Again, they make the value judgment, how unfortunate. But then the governor comes through conscripting all the kids and they don't take his because he's got the broken leg, and they say, how fortunate. It's like the value judgment just doesn't make any sense. It's fickle. It keeps changing. And so what they're saying is that when you understand these patterns, it allows you to be more tolerant of what's happening, in that sense of being more accepting of what is, the things that you can't actually change anything about. But that doesn't mean that there aren't things where you do take action, right? It just means that how you take action is going to be not necessarily based off of this binary of good versus evil, right? This is a big challenge for the Taoists. They're like, how can you even define such a thing? But and it's almost kind of like a utilitarian type thing, right? Like we can look at what are we trying to achieve in terms of some goal and why. And if we can demonstrate that it's more in keeping with the harmony of the way things are, then that would be evaluated as a worthy goal versus something where maybe you're trying to fight against it. But this first part here, knowing that constancy, first off, seeing the patterns opens our minds up to being able to see what's there. To be ignorant of that sets us up for disaster because we could be working against things that are actually in our own self-interest. The second thing he's saying is that understanding this constancy also allows us to be more tolerant or accepting of these things that we don't actually even have any control over. Followed by then to say to be tolerant is to be community minded. Now, this particular translation is where, I mean, this part of it is where normally it's brought in this idea about rulership. So community minded here is how this particular author is translating this part in terms of thinking about it, and of community minded in terms of thinking about engaging larger amounts of people in governing in some way. So you could take this at a personal kind of level, or you could take it from, more kind of a leadership kind of level. But we have this idea then about being community minded. We've got that openness, we've got that acceptance and that tolerance that allows us to be connected in that way. And then he says to be community minded then is to be holistic, taking in that big picture. And we can start to see, like, if we're thinking about this from a rulership perspective, a governing perspective, this is something that we need to be aware of. How do all the pieces fit together? We can't just meddle with this one thing without recognizing the repercussions all over the place, right? We need to take the big picture in mind. Now, part of this you'll see where he's got in the square brackets here, this translator's letting you know where he's importing a thought that doesn't seem to be in the actual text. And part of that is because it's a very minimalist kind of a text. And so there's kind of some assumptions about how things are translated. He's just being very clear where he's adding in based on what he perceives the way the text should be understood in English, even though it might not be explicit in the classical Chinese. So then he continues to say to be holistic is to join with heaven. Now, heaven is a tricky word for us because we've got a lot of baggage with that term in terms of what does that mean exactly. And I would argue, and not just myself, but others, that heaven in this sense is not like the realm of divine beings so much as it's talking about how in English we might talk about the heavens, like we see birds flying in the heavens or clouds in the heavens. So it's more like the sky, or when we look up and see the cosmos. And in a very real sense, they look at the sky and at the heavens to understand, again, these patterns, things like the seasons and what happens with the sun, what happens with the moon and the movement of the stars. And they see these patterns and how they move. And they will sometimes, because of that, talk about how the movement of things in the sky seems to control what's happening on the ground in terms of like how we go through those seasons. And so they'll sometimes talk about heaven having some kind of controlling aspect. But it's really recognizing these patterns and how they have an impact. Another way that we could talk about heaven legitimately, I think, within this context, we could say cosmos, or even more broadly yet, nature. Right? To be holistic is to join with the cosmos, or to join with nature. To join with heaven is to follow the way, and way is capitalized here for when it's using the term Tao. To follow the way is to last long. Now that's kind of interesting, because later, more religious aspects of Taoism have a big concern with the idea of longevity, to the point of even thinking that there's the possibility of immortality in physical form, and some interesting ways that they attempted to try and get there. But I don't think this is what's trying to be addressed in this phrase here. I think the idea is that there's this idea of enduring, like when we are actually following the Tao, paying attention to those patterns that lead then, because of that paying attention, what we saw here, that this idea of well, first off, the enlightenment versus disaster, but then kind of the chain of events that we see, or chain of outlook of this idea of tolerance, to community minded, to holistic, to joining with heaven, or this idea of nature, to joining finally with this idea of the Tao, or the way. Right? There's this progression of that happens as a consequence from clearing the mind to see what is, to recognize the patterns, and how does that unfold, and how is that relevant or necessary in terms of thinking about leadership or governance. And then it's talking about is to last long, I think has to do with something that's going to be more enduring, because it's not working against the things that be. There's a final kind of a thought here that he's going to have as kind of almost like a therefore, but maybe I'll kind of pause at this point and see if you have any thoughts on how this is kind of unfolding.
I actually have to go.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's just gotta go.
Bye. I actually think this kind of flows with the previous slides. That this makes sense. It kind of goes together in my mind.
Very good. So the final then, right, it's in quotes here. Life is not in danger of extinction. Now this line is really radically different in a lot of the different translations. What I find interesting with this translation is it's taking, if I remember correctly, in just like the basic text, it's saying essentially all life, not danger. And so some of it would take it to be all in terms of your entire life. Here he's looking at it more in terms of life, in terms of like the biosystem, right? All life is not in danger of extinction. And extinction here is, if all life was in danger, what would that mean? It would mean extinction. So he's saying ultimately, if this whole line of thinking flows from that initially freeing our minds of our social constructs to look directly at what is, and we see those patterns, and by recognizing those patterns, there's these natural consequences in terms of how we perceive the world. We are going to avoid danger. We're going to have enlightenment, which is ultimately going to result in not needing to be concerned about extinction. I mean, in the sense of there could still obviously be like natural disasters or whatnot, asteroid could still hit the earth. But in general, I think they're talking more about, from a governing perspective, right? That if from a governing perspective, we're able to keep these things in mind, we'll be able to avoid these kinds of dangers. Would be the ultimate place he's trying to get to.
When you say dangers, you think it's those kinds of dangers like we face today, the climate change that is human caused, and we are more with the nature, we are more with the world as it is, without interfering and causing challenges and causing the social wars and physical, wars, like those kinds of dangers that come out of pride and power and stuff like that.
I think that's ultimately where he's going. I mean, I know there's a lot of discussion about, is climate change human caused, and do we even need to be concerned about it? So I don't want to try and answer that question here, but we could say, whether we're talking about simply pollution, or the fact that certain species have gone extinct, or the issue that we've contaminated a lot of our sources of things like water and air with chemicals that we're not sure even what kind of effect they have on our bodies, right? These would be things we could look at as dangers that were a consequence of not recognizing that holistic kind of approach of how everything is connected. If we would have had more of that perspective in mind, if we would have been looking more towards these other ways of engaging with our environment from a perspective that everything is connected, who knows where we would find ourselves today? It could have been a very different context. So, yeah.
Yeah, I feel that. Yeah.
Yeah.
It almost reminds me of like homesteading, right? Like that kind of feels like it's the way to return and not engage and just strip away the restrictions and just do you, kind of you do you kind of situation. Yeah, and it's interesting, Jim. I'm finding obviously trying to push my understanding of all that you're teaching here, you're talking through, to try to tie it to something tangible. Oh yeah, that aligns with something that I know, that I've seen, that I've experienced, and that's different.
Yeah.
You're pushing the limits.
It does take some effort to connect those dots, and it is at a little bit more of a kind of a higher level of more generic almost, where it's saying we need to start with essentially seeing clearly, and really we could apply this to kind of any problem, any situation that we're dealing with. If we've got a problem that we need to untangle, the first step is to clearly see what the actual problem is, right? Because if you try to solve the wrong problem, you'll be busy, but you might be doing the wrong thing. You might not actually reach your goal of trying to untangle whatever the mess is. So we have to be able to see clearly what we're actually dealing with in order to effectively address the issue. And I think that's really kind of the key point here, is they're trying to encourage a process of recognizing when we might have filters or biases that are impacting our perception of reality. And the more we can become aware of those, it allows us to see more clearly, which then hopefully is going to allow us to see a better way that we should proceed based off of our better perception of the current situation or reality in general. So whether you're talking about a homelessness issue, hunger issues, pollution issues, work production issues, right? I mean, you could solving a problem with computer code. It always comes back to, what blinders do I have on? Can I get those off? Can I see what's actually the issue, understand what the real need is, and then figure out a way to kind of connect those dots?
which in a way seems almost contradictory, right? Like, how can you solve something, but while trying to take everything in, right? Like
Well,
without putting those blinders on the focus on the one thing you're trying to solve, because one cannot boil the ocean, kind of deal, right?
well, it's going to be, yes, we have to have that broad perspective, but there's nothing wrong with having more of a narrow perspective for a particular issue. But again, it's trying to see with clarity. And that's where I think the big thing is trying to bring into play here is the more we can see clearly and recognize when we've got blinders or biases, then the better off we're going to be at getting to the next step of how do we solve something, or whether or not it even needs to be solved, right? That could be another
Yeah.
possible.
That's a very, very, very good point.
To close real quick and just thank
Yes.
everybody for joining us today. And if you'd like to join us, you can register your email at www.kinship.cafe, and we'd love to see you next time. All right. Take care.
Thank you so much, Jim. Take care.